Peter Reilly had no reason to believe that day would be remembered. It had been completely ordinary. He had spent the evening at his church youth group, laughed with friends, and headed home, already thinking about getting some sleep. But the moment he stepped inside, something felt wrong. The house was unusually quiet. Then he noticed something on the floor, a faint trail of blood. He followed it. Seconds later, he found his mother. She had been brutally murdered. Peter froze. Then he did what almost anyone would do. He called for help. Less than 24 hours later, the police said he was the killer. Peter couldn't understand what was happening. Only hours earlier, he had been the one asking for help. Now, he was the one answering questions. The detectives wanted to know everything: where he'd been, who he'd spoken to, what his relationship with his mother was like. Peter answered calmly. He had nothing to hide. The more he cooperated, the more convinced he became that this was all just part of the investigation. Sooner or later, they would find the real killer. But something about the detectives never changed. They weren't searching for one. They looked at Peter as if they had already found him. Every answer he gave only led to another question. Every explanation was met with another doubtful look. It didn't make sense. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no blood on his clothes. And yet, the people sitting across the table seemed absolutely certain. Peter still trusted his own memory. He still knew where he had been that night. What he didn't know was how long he could keep believing it. The questions never really changed, only the way they were asked. Are you sure? Think carefully. Try again. At first, Peter answered with complete confidence. Every answer came easily, because he wasn't trying to remember a lie. He was remembering the truth. Then the detectives suggested something he hadn't even considered. Would he be willing to take a polygraph test? A lie detector. Peter agreed almost instantly. To him, it wasn't a risk. It was the fastest way to prove his innocence. A few hours later, the detectives returned. The test, they said, showed he wasn't telling the truth. Peter frowned. There had to be some mistake. But the detectives didn't look confused. They looked relieved, as if the machine had simply confirmed what they had believed all along. Then one of them quietly said, "Peter, maybe you're not lying. Maybe you just don't remember." The room fell silent. It sounded impossible until the detectives gave him a reason to believe it. They spoke about trauma, about memories the brain sometimes hides, about people who do terrible things and genuinely can't recall them afterward. Peter wanted to reject every word, but certainty has a strange habit. The longer you're surrounded by it, the harder it becomes to ignore. For the first time, Peter stopped trying to convince the detectives. Instead, he found himself trying to convince himself. And a thought entered his mind that had never existed before. What if they're right? And I'm wrong. For the next several hours, the detectives kept returning to the same idea. Maybe you don't remember. Maybe your mind is protecting you. Peter replayed the night over and over again, leaving the church, driving home, walking through the front door, finding his mother. Every memory felt exactly the same, yet somehow it no longer felt certain. The detectives noticed it. They no longer had to argue with Peter. Peter had begun arguing with himself. Then came a question that changed everything. If you don't remember, then how do you know you didn't do it? Peter had no answer. Silence filled the room. For the first time, being innocent no longer felt like proof. Hours later, Peter did something that should have been impossible. He began describing a murder that had never happened. Not because he suddenly remembered it, because he had stopped trusting the memories he already had. The detectives finally had what they wanted. A confession. The case appeared to be over. But if the story had really ended there, you would never have heard Peter Reilly's name. Because outside that interrogation room, something refused to agree with his confession. The confession changed everything. At least, that's what everyone thought. The newspapers had their story. The police had their suspect. The case looked finished. But then, someone asked a simple question. Could Peter actually have done it? Not emotionally, physically. Investigators began reconstructing his movements that night, minute by minute. Peter had left the church youth meeting, surrounded by people who saw him there. A few minutes later, He was calling friends in panic after discovering his mother's body. Then the police arrived. The timeline was astonishingly tight, almost impossibly tight. There was barely enough time to commit the murder, clean himself up, hide every trace of evidence, and calmly call for help. Then came another problem. There was no blood on Peter's clothes, no blood beneath his fingernails, no physical evidence placing him at the murder scene before he found the body. One by one, the facts began refusing to cooperate. The confession said Peter was guilty. The evidence kept saying something else. And that's when the investigation took an unexpected turn. People stopped asking, "Why did Peter confess?" They started asking a far more unsettling question. Why did the confession sound so believable? If it wasn't true, the confession should have ended the case. Instead, it reopened it, because no matter how many times investigators replayed Peter's words, one question refused to go away. When could he have done it? The more they reconstructed that night, the less the confession made sense. Peter had left the church youth meeting surrounded by people who saw him. Minutes later, he was calling friends in panic after finding his mother's body. Then the police arrived. There wasn't just a lack of evidence. There was a lack of time. Then another strange detail surfaced. Peter's clothes. No blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the crime and the confession belonged to two different people. One committed the murder, the other simply admitted to it. And then, the case took one final turn. A prosecutor reviewing the investigation discovered something that had never reached Peter's defense. Witness statements, information that supported Peter's timeline, evidence that should have raised serious doubts, long before he ever stood accused. Years later, the charges against Peter Reilly were finally dismissed. He walked out of court a free man. But freedom didn't answer the question that haunted everyone. If Peter didn't kill his mother, who taught him a story convincing enough to confess? Because Peter hadn't just signed a confession, he had described a murder that never happened. Peter eventually walked free, not because he proved his confession was false, because the evidence proved it couldn't have been true. Think about that for a moment. An innocent man confessed. The evidence disagreed. And in the end, the evidence was more reliable than his own memory. That sounds impossible, until you realize Peter's memory was never the real target. His certainty was. The detectives didn't have to convince Peter that he was guilty. They only had to convince him that he might be wrong. Once that happened, Peter did the rest himself. Years later, psychologists would study cases like Peter's and discover something deeply unsettling. Memory isn't a video recording. Every time we revisit it, we rebuild it. Most of the time, that doesn't matter. But under enough pressure, when authority replaces confidence and doubt replaces certainty, people can begin trusting someone else's version of events more than their own. That's why Peter's story still matters, not because it was unbelievable, but because it revealed something about every human mind. We like to believe that our memories belong entirely to us. Peter Reilly discovered that sometimes they don't.